Now, I thought it was interesting in 1320, so a long time ago in a galaxy not far away, it was our planet, Dante wrote in the Divine Comedy that Ruth was, he said, the gleaner made meek ancestress of David the psalmist. And I kind of felt like what Dante did there when he called her she's just this gleaner, this meek woman, one of the ancestors of David. I kind of felt like Dante was falling into a trap that a lot of people do when they think about the book of Ruth. That you have probably heard people talk about Ruth as like, it's just this beautiful love story. And we kind of romanticize it because we've grown up with all these Disney fairy tale romance movies and the Prince Charming who finds the common girl and now she's a princess and a queen and it's so exciting and amazing. And Ruth and Boaz, it was like love at first sight. It was so beautiful. And I think what's happening, and some of my favorite scholars that have written about this all say this, is that we sometimes read these ancient texts through our culture, right? That we grow up with these love stories, and we see this, and we go, oh, Ruth and Boaz end up married. This is a beautiful story. But it's so much more than that. And oftentimes we display Ruth as like this really meek, quiet woman, but Ruth was not. Like, Ruth was assertive. Ruth takes charge of things. Ruth is one of these few women in the Bible. Here she is. She's a foreigner. She's dirt poor. Like, she's lost everything. In the culture, she has like no status. As someone that doesn't have a husband and whose father is from another country and far away. So she is poor. She has no status as a woman. All these things are stacked against her. And she tells people she tells Boaz, who is a leader in the community, what to do. We're going to see this happen. And he's like wealthy, and he's Jewish, and he's a leader in the community, and he's a man. And Boaz is like, no, that's great. Yeah, absolutely. And he does what she says. He follows her lead. Ruth is an incredible story of a woman who was assertive, who took the lead in a culture where women were treated like property, and she stands out as someone who was listened to and followed. Ruth is a story of love, but not sappy love. Right? Nobody is simping for anyone in this story. I'm hip and cool. I use words like simping. Jim is offended. The other week, we were talking about some story about when Heather and I were dating, because back in the day, I had a crush on Heather for several years before Heather started to see me that way, that before God opened her eyes to the gift that was in front of her. And before we started dating, and Caleb goes, Dad was a simp. And I was like, what? He was like, you're a simp and we're mom. And I was like,
super intense mom player.
No. And even Noah was like, dude, what's wrong with you, man? If he hadn't, you literally wouldn't exist. So, whatever. Anyways, Ruth is a story about love, but not sappy romantic love. It's about hesed, this loving kindness, graciousness, loyalty that goes beyond the call of duty. And last week we saw Naomi's hesed when she was telling Ruth and Orpah, just go back to your families. Even though they would have been so helpful for her, she was like, no, just go back. Like, her loving kindness was this, it would be so much better. I release you, go, like whatever. And Ruth's hesed was when she chose to stay with Naomi, even though it was a much harder path and it would have been totally okay for her to stay home with her family. That would have been the easier thing. Nobody would have judged her for it. We don't judge Orpah for it. Orpah made a good decision. Right? And so we need to honor that Orpah made a good decision. But Ruth demonstrated hesed. And that brings us to chapter 2, where Ruth and Naomi are now in Bethlehem. They're living there. They don't have anything. And in verse 2 of chapter 2, it says, one day Ruth the Moabite, in case you forgot she was a foreigner, said to Naomi, let me go out to the harvest fields to pick up the stalks of grain left behind by anyone who is kind enough to let me do it." Naomi replied, "All right, my daughter, go ahead." So Ruth went out to gather grain behind the harvesters. And as it happened, the original Hebrew is essentially like, coincidentally, nobody planned this. Naomi didn't say, "Hey, you should go check out Boaz's field." Nobody planned. She just randomly ends up working in a field that belonged to Boaz, the relative of her father-in-law, Elimelech. Now, Ruth doesn't know this, right? She doesn't know the community yet and who all is related to who and whatever. But she happens to end up in Boaz's field. Ruth was taking initiative to provide for herself and for Naomi. Thousands of years ago when this happened, there were no social services. There was no government help or assistance for those that were in poverty. And for widows, women without a husband, without a father around to take care of them, they were part of the culture that was in a desperate need. And so in ancient times, they had passed these laws to help specifically those who were poor, widows, and foreigners, people that were traveling through the land or traveling into the land and didn't have anything. And the law, it was called gleaning, but basically it was this, that farmers who owned land were not allowed, when they would go to harvest their stuff, now normally the impulse would be like, I'm going to get every bit of my harvest so I can sell all of it and make every bit of money I can. And the law was, hey, you just harvest the majority of the field. Don't bother with the corners, the stuff on the side. And then when your crew, your workers go through, because they had workers that would cut down the wheat, and then other workers that would bundle it up so they could take it off to sale. They go, look, as they're going through, let them do their one pass, and if they drop anything or miss anything, they don't go back for it. They just leave it. And the people that are poor, the widows, the foreigners, anyone in need can then come and pick up the stuff that was left behind accidentally. And this was called gleaning. And it typically meant about 10% of the harvest got left behind. Now, gleaning was hard work. If you worked all day long gleaning, you could pick up enough grain to feed one person for one day. It was a lot of work to just take care of yourself and exist. And Ruth is going out, and she's like hoping to glean enough for 2 people. Well, as she's gleaning, Boaz arrives on the scene and says hello to all of his workers. And it says in verse 5, then Boaz asks his foreman, who's that young woman over there? Who does she belong to? Because it wasn't a huge community, and people in small communities, over time, everybody knows everybody. Right? Like all the people recognized Naomi when she came back. They're like, oh my word, is this Naomi? But Ruth is new. Nobody knows Ruth. And so for Boaz, who probably got used to seeing certain people that were gleaning and knew the people, who's this woman? Like she's clearly a foreigner. She's not from around here. Who is she? The foreman replied, she is the young woman from Moab who came back with Naomi. She asked me this morning if she could gather grain behind the harvesters. She has been hard at work ever since, except for a few minutes rest in the shelter. Now, you might not know it, but there was something incredibly shocking in Ruth's request to the foreman. And here's what it was. A harvest normally worked like this. Boaz and other farmers like him would hire a group of men, and they would go through with sickles. They're those curved blades that you use to cut crops. The men would go through first, and they grab the wheat, cut it, and drop it. And then following behind them would be a crew of women that Boaz, or whatever farmer it was, hired to follow behind, picking up the grain, putting it in bundles, and having it go on carts to be taken away to be sold. After those 2 groups went through, then the gleaners could come through and pick up stuff. When Ruth asked if she could gather grain behind the harvesters, she was asking, hey, can I glean behind the men cutting the grain? Like, I don't want to glean after everything's been picked up. Can I glean up there with all the workers? Because she's thinking, like, I got to get enough for 2 people. And I can't do it if I'm following behind. She asked, this was a shocking request. Like, how dare she ask for so much more? And Boaz, if he had done what most owners had done, he would have said, absolutely not. Get off my property. Go glean somewhere else. You have some nerve coming here, some foreign woman, asking and questioning how we do things. But here's the thing, is Ruth was asking this not because she was greedy, but because she was trying to make sure both Naomi and her could be fed. And the letter of the law said the gleaners follow behind, but the spirit of the law, the reason the law was created was so that hungry people could be fed, right? And Boaz has this moment of clarity where he realizes, hey, the spirit of this law is more important than the letter of it. And he's heard of Ruth already, which we're about to see, because of what she's done for Naomi. And so Boaz not only goes, yeah, absolutely, go ahead. He goes, in fact, work up there, stay with my men and my women where you'll be safe. And then he tells all the men, hey, you better protect her. Like, make sure nothing happens to you, because it was dangerous to be a woman by yourself back then. It's dangerous today to be a woman by yourself in some places, right? And so he's like, you guys are taking care of her. And then he tells her, and Ruth, if you get thirsty, you can have some of the water that my men pull up out of the well. Well, this would have been shocking too, because back in the day, women got the water out of the well for the men. Men were not serving women water, especially not foreign, really dirt poor women. But Boaz is like, hey, my men, they'll give you some water if you get thirsty. Well, Ruth, all of this was shocking. Ruth knew she was going out on a limb just asking to gather grain up where there's piles of it on the ground before the other women have bundled it up to sell. Ruth knew that was a bold request. Boaz taking it and giving so much more was shocking to her. So it says that Ruth fell at his feet and thanked him warmly. What have I done to deserve such kindness, she asked. I'm only a foreigner. Yes, I know, Boaz replied, but I also know about everything you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. I've heard how you left your father and mother in your own land to live here among complete strangers. May the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge, reward you fully for what you've done. Now, some people think that, Boaz, it was like a love at first sight thing when people kind of romanticize the story. He saw Ruth and was like, oh, I'm in love with her. Here, have all this food. Go ahead and keep working really hard in my fields. That's a great way to impress a lady. But I don't really think that's what's going on here, because realistically, it would never occur to Boaz, hey, I want to marry this girl. Partially because she was most likely in her mid-20s, early to mid-20s. She was younger. He was probably at least in his mid-40s. In fact, many times in the book, he calls her daughter, because he's a whole generation older. He's an older guy. He already has wives and children. Back in the day, they'd have a bunch of wives. It was weird. We kind of leave that part out when we go, it's so romantic that she gets to join all of his other wives. Anyways, don't put that in your notes. He was wealthy and influential. She was poor and a foreigner that was an enemy to their country. Like, all of these reasons, it would never even occur to Boaz to be like, hubba hubba. No. Boaz was just moved by, this is an incredible woman. Like, everything she's done for Naomi. Ruth has stepped up more to take care of this Jewish woman than even her Jewish neighbors and friends and other relatives. Ruth's done more. And so Boaz is impressed by this nobleness of her, and because of the incredible hesed that Ruth is showing, Boaz demonstrates incredible hesed, incredible loving kindness to her. When Ruth goes home to Naomi that night, instead of coming home with 1 day's worth of food, she actually comes home with 28 pounds of grain. Normally you could pick up about 1 to 2 pounds in a day, working as a whatever. She comes home with 28 pounds. Because Boaz was like, here, let me give you a bunch to kind of jumpstart you having food at home while you continue to work. Naomi's stunned. And she goes, where in the world were you? And Ruth goes, well, I was in this field owned by some guy named Boaz. And at that point, Naomi goes, oh, he was a relative of my husband. Interesting. And then a bunch of time passes. What? Where's the audio? There was supposed to be audio. Oh, well. It was all the SpongeBob time passes. I was particularly satisfied with it. Anyways, this isn't some like he saw her and they got married. No, then Ruth works through the whole rest of that harvest. And then she works through another harvest. And more time goes by, and it ends up being sometime in summer. And around there, Naomi has started to shift gears. Now we're getting into chapter 3. Naomi was so depressed before, but now she's starting to have some hope for the future. And she's starting to think about Ruth. Up till now, Ruth has been taking care of her. They're both grieving. They both lost their husbands. But Ruth has been the one showing. Well, now Naomi goes, you know what? I got to do something for Ruth. I got to make sure she gets a husband. So here's what, and more specifically, Naomi's like, Ruth's going to marry Boaz. We're making this happen. And so here's what she tells Ruth to do. She goes, Boaz is a close relative of ours, and he's been very kind by letting you gather grain with his young women. Tonight, he will be winnowing barley at the threshing floor. How many of you have ever winnowed barley at the threshing floor? Yeah, neither have I. It's something to do with turning the stuff that they cut into something they could actually use and eat. Okay? I don't know. I'm not a farmer. He goes, so tonight he's going to be winnowing barley at the threshing floor. Now, do as I tell you. Take a bath, put on some perfume, and dress in your nicest clothes. Then go to the threshing floor, but don't let Boaz see you until he has finished eating and drinking. Be sure to notice where he lies down, because there might be some other dudes there too. It was such a long day of work. They would end up just sleeping there so they could get up and keep working the next day. So she's like, be sure you notice where he lies down, then go, uncover his feet, and lie down there. He will tell you what to do. Let's talk about this. The bath, the perfume, the nicest clothes. Naomi was telling her, you're dressing up like a bride. Like Boaz is going to know immediately this is what somebody looks like and smells like on their wedding day. And so Naomi's kind of going, just sneak up, looking like a bride on her wedding day, uncover his feet, and let him tell you what to do. Because hopefully he will pick up on this very subtle hint and agree to marry you. Let Boaz do the math. Now, I'm just going to say this because at some point you might hear somebody say this, and I have a different opinion. Some have understood the phrase, uncover his feet, is something a little more PG-13 or R-rated-ish. Something sexual. Okay? And so some have suggested a lot more happened that night than just some talking. I don't think that's accurate. Now, the reality is the ancient Hebrew phrase, uncover his feet, could have a double meaning, an innuendo, in it could be code for uncovering something else. Here's why some of you are like, just shut up, McNutt, we get it. Here's why I don't think what this is telling us is that Ruth came on to Boaz and they did some stuff that we would talk about in a different series. Because at the end of their conversation, spoiler alert, Boaz is going to go, yeah, no, I want to marry you, except that there's this other guy that has first dibs. There's a closer relative that has first dibs. And so out of respect of him, I have to let him have the choice first. And Boaz is going to talk about how virtuous and how incredible Ruth is. And Boaz is celebrated as a guy with integrity and all. So I just kind of go, yeah, this phrase could have a double meaning, but I don't think that's what's happening here because it makes such a big deal out of both of their integrities and honoring this other person as well. And so I don't think that's what was happening. Now, well, we'll get to what the family redeemer thing is in a moment. Back to the story. Around midnight, Boaz suddenly woke up because Ruth has snuck in. She's uncovered his feet. He felt the cold air on them, and or maybe felt a little alarmed that someone was there. When my kids were a lot younger and they would sometimes sneak into the bed, I would wake up and be like, this is not cool. They need to go away, and Heather is a lot nicer than me and would let them stay. And so then the option was I could go away, which was not cool. Ruth, around midnight, Boaz suddenly woke up and turned over. He was surprised to find a woman lying at his feet. No kidding, he was surprised. So he goes, who are you? He asked. I am your servant Ruth, she replied. And then she immediately ignores what Naomi told her to do, where she was just supposed to be quiet and let Boaz take the hint to marry her. And she goes, spread the corner of your covering over me, for you are my family redeemer. Here's what a family redeemer is. We talked about last week when Naomi was going, hey, I'm too old to have another son to grow up to marry you. Back then, because women, widows, they couldn't keep their land, they couldn't keep, all the status and position, everything came through the husband. The family redeemer law was that if a man died without having a son, the closest male relative, usually it was a brother, would marry the widow and have a son in the dead man's name so that this son could grow up, own the land, have the income, take care of the mother, and continue the family name. It actually was an expensive thing for this family redeemer, whether it was a brother or a close male relative if there were no brothers, like a Boaz, because it meant that they had to pay to take care of this land and invest money into it, even though none of their children or their family name would be passed on by. It came with some expense. Well, that's what the family redeemer thing was. And so Ruth is saying to them, when she's saying, spread your covers, she's going, hey, you're my family redeemer. Like, I want you to marry me, to be my family redeemer, to fulfill the role that honestly you should have already stepped up and done. Ruth shouldn't have had to ask him to do it. The family redeemer should have known, this is what I need to do, this is my responsibility. And she's going, help me with this. And this could have gone really badly, because she's essentially proposing, and a woman proposing back then, that's not great. He could have thrown her out. Nobody would have judged Boaz for throwing her out because she was a foreigner. They could kind of get away with ignoring some of these things. But instead, Boaz has a very different response. He says, the Lord bless you, my daughter, Boaz exclaimed. You're showing even more family loyalty now than you did before, for you've not gone after a younger man, whether rich or poor. Now don't worry about a thing, my daughter. I will do what is necessary, for everyone in town knows you are a virtuous woman. And what he goes on to tell her is, look, I will totally do this. However, there is a closer male relative, and he has to officially say that he would rather me do it for me to do it. So he goes, look, I'm going to talk to him. We're going to sort it out. But no matter what, you're getting married, either to him or to me. This is getting taken care of. And the chapter closes with these words from Naomi once Ruth fills her in on what happened. Naomi said to her, just be patient, my daughter, until we hear what happens. The man won't rest until he has settled things today. See, this story isn't just some fairy tale love story. It's a story of loving kindness. It's Boaz realizing in that moment, instead of feeling defensive or upset, going, no, she's right. I'm absolutely going to do this. I'm going to make sure that this family is taken care of. I will be the family redeemer if I need to be the family redeemer, even though it'll come at cost to me and all these different... He'll do it. Ruth is showing incredible loving kindness because he's right. She could have just gone out and tried to meet some other husband and start her life over. But what that would have meant is Naomi would have lost her land, would have lost her family name. She would have gone on to be this widow with no one to take care of her. Ruth choosing this path was looking out not for her, but also for Naomi. And that's why Boaz was like, this is, your loving kindness is incredible. Your loyalty to Naomi is incredible. And I think there's three things that we learn about love from these two chapters, from what's going on here. The first is that loving kindness is intentional. What's intentional? Intentional is when you decide to do something. You make a plan to do something. Intentional is a way of saying, like, I'm going to make this happen. You don't just sit back and hope it'll happen. Do you see how intentional Ruth was in these chapters? She decided to glean. She asked to glean with the harvester. She stepped out on a limb to try and provide more for Naomi and herself. She told Boaz he was the family redeemer. Being a Ruth means being intentional. Deciding to be lovingly kind and then deciding to take steps to make it happen. She showed incredible courage each of those times. Right? None of those were easy things to do or ask. She risked rejection. She risked people getting angry. She risked her status. And yet the payoff is that she's celebrated as an incredible example of hesed. Loving kindness means being intentional. Loving kindness is patient. What do I mean by this? The book of Ruth is pretty short. It's only 4 chapters. There's an audio Bible that's so cool, Streetlights. It's like hip-hop artists reading the Bible. You can find it. Look up Streetlights, Ruth, on YouTube. It's artists from where Propaganda came from, that recording label, Humble Beast. Reading the Bible with sweet beats behind it. It takes all of 12 minutes to read the entire book of Ruth. It's a short book, right? And so it's easy for us to sometimes to kind of read through it and think it all happened fast, but it didn't. Ruth spent months working in these fields. She spent months desperately trying to provide, and there were so many things that were not on her radar. But her loving kindness to Naomi was patient. She kept doing the work. 1 Corinthians 13:4 says, love is patient and kind. That it waits, that it doesn't get impatient, it doesn't give up. When I was reading that and thinking about that, I was kind of like, who in my life do I need to be patient with, right? That I want to love and show patience to, and sometimes it's a family member, sometimes it's a friend, sometimes it's somebody I know, but that God is going, look, don't expect stuff to just happen overnight. Like sometimes you need to be patient to show loving kindness. And then finally, loving kindness sacrifices. Boaz sacrifices for Ruth and Naomi over and over. He gives of his harvest. He provides resources. He commits to marriage, which next week we'll talk a bit more about why that's at great cost. Ruth sacrifices for Naomi. She sacrifices her home. She sacrifices her family. She sacrifices everything she knows to come and be with Naomi. In James chapter 1, verse 27, when I was thinking about everything that Boaz gives to Naomi and Ruth, it reminded me of this verse that says, pure and genuine religion in the sight of God the Father means caring for orphans and widows in their distress and refusing to let the world corrupt you. See, Boaz was demonstrating Christ's love when he gave to these two widows and was so generous with them. The Bible talks about this being pure and genuine religion because in the culture back then, a widow could do nothing for you. They had nothing to give, no status, nothing. And so giving to them, being generous to them, loving to them was the most sacrificial type of love because it meant you had no ulterior motives. And Boaz, up until this moment where Ruth is like, hey, marry me, dude, it wasn't on his radar that, oh yeah, like I want to impress this girl and maybe we can marry. Like he was just being generous. He was just being sacrificial. Loving kindness sacrifices. And Boaz is demonstrating this incredible hesed that might not make sense on earth, but has incredible eternal value to God. So where do you need to demonstrate loving kindness? As we're talking about Ruth and Boaz and Naomi, where do you go, here's some areas that I need to grow in hesed. Maybe in my school, maybe with my family, maybe on my sports team, maybe with my friends. Ask God to show you where you can grow in intentionality, in patience, where you can have loving kindness that sacrifices. Maybe tell someone, your small group leader, a friend, Melissa, Elijah, me, so we can help be a part of you intentionally going after some of this. I think being a Ruth or being a Boaz is just an incredible opportunity and gift that we can be a part of. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for this story. We thank you so much for Ruth and Boaz and their examples that we're reading about, and ask that you would help us to have that kind of loving kindness through our intentionality, through our patience, through our sacrificing for others. Use us for your glory this week. In Jesus' name, amen.